Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Today we do the program called Mythbusters, and the co-host is Chris Rossini, and Chris is also the editor of the RonPaulLibertyReport.com. Chris, good to have you with us today. What is the subject going to be about?
Good morning, Dr. Paul. Glad to be with you again. Today we're going to cover the Federal Reserve. We'll start with they've been around for a little over 100 years, and they've given us one economic crisis after another in those 100 years, and they got started right away with the lead up to the Great Depression, with the stock market bubble that they created. But that's long gone, and the people that are alive today, have experienced different economic booms and busts created by the Fed, most recently with the stock market bubble, where dot-coms were created that should have never been created. With the housing bubble, where houses and shopping centers and developments that should never have been created were, and people were buying houses that had no business buying a house. And even more recently, with the oil boom and bust that we've seen, and you've had a firsthand look at it down in Texas. So please give us a synopsis on how the Fed keeps creating these false, illusory economic booms.
Well, they've been around a long time. Matter of fact, they've been known throughout all of history, but they've been worse in the last 100 years, and especially in the last 40 years, since we don't have any connection to gold since 1971. So there's more booms and more busts, more malinvestment, more debt, and more mistakes ever. And this will continue as long as we have central banking, especially at its worst, and that's what we have today. We do have some advantage as the issuing of the reserve currency of the world, some advantages which a lot of people don't understand and realize, but the long-term disadvantages are so overwhelming to everybody involved, even those who benefit on the short run. But there certainly is a boom period of the cycle. Matter of fact, in free markets, there are cycles, but they modulate softly, supply and demand. This encourages people to produce, and prices go down, and they might cut back. But that's self-adjusting, and it has to do more with a particular commodity and less to do, essentially not at all, if you have a sound currency that is not gyrating. But the real danger that we see in booms and busts and hurting a lot of people, that comes from a central bank. And the key to that problem is the fact that central banks have come along, not originally when the Federal Reserve was started, but certainly in the last 40 years, they have become more arrogant and believing and convinced that they know what interest rates ought to be. They know what the precise amount of money supply there has to be. And because on the short run, it can seem to stimulate and help some people. On the long run, it causes a lot of mistakes, and then that of course is when the boom ends. But you can create a boom, and you already mentioned, Chris, the fact that we had a boom in NASDAQ's stocks. Looks like it's going to happen again. Right now there's a boom in bonds, and that's going to end badly. We had a housing boom. And that isn't, just the, supply and demand alterations that come in a natural market. These are extreme, where things go way up and then way down, and then there's a lot of people who suffer, and that, of course, is where the unfair part comes in. But in the boom cycle, there's a lot of malinvestment. Money goes to the wrong places for the wrong reason. It is responsible for creating debt, and creates these bubbles. Now, when it comes to oil, it's interesting that most people think it's only a supply and demand of oil, and that's the whole thing. And that is important. But if oil prices are boosted because the inflation of the money supply, the money supply pushes prices up in some area, all prices don't go up evenly. If you increase the money supply by 10% a year, and all prices and wages went up 10%, it wouldn't be a problem. but they can't predict. And this is what's driving the Fed nuts, because they're printing money like crazy in this so-called boom that they're trying to recreate, but the money doesn't go where they want it to go. And sometimes it will go into, stocks or bonds or whatever, or houses. But right now, we're witnessing the results of excessive money supply pushing the prices of oil up too high, over $100, $140. It's been very, very high. Tremendous incentive to look for more oil. There must be an oil shortage, according to what the economic factors are telling us. So people get into the business of increasing the supply. They think, well, it's the end of crude oil. I mean, we're not going to have enough, so there we have to have alternative sources. And then they get into fracking. So they make decisions based on the fact that prices are artificially high, and they base everything on a high price of oil. But then there's a second step that the Fed gets involved in, because people come along and the technology's there, and somebody figured out how you can get oil out of shale, which is pretty amazing to me, the technology. And there's a lot of oil and there's a lot of gas, and you use this fracking process. But there's no market decision made here. If it were a market decision, you'd go by how much money is being saved. Is the money in the savings account, and people are looking for that? And then is there a need for more energy, and that the price of oil is not artificial, which wasn't the case. But all of a sudden, they get all this money for investing in fracking, and then lo and behold, the supply of oil, instead of seemed to be short and prices too high, the supply is too much, and the prices crash. And then there's an unwinding of this, because debt is pyramid in the boom phases. It's pyramided because you have fractional reserve banking, and it has to unwind. It goes in the opposite direction. When you have fractional reserves, you build and build, and it looks like everything's going just great until people go bankrupt and they start peeling this off and declaring they want their money back, and people want their money out of the banks or go someplace else, and then that causes the crash. And that is the reason, a major reason why we have this oil problem. Houston's been hit. Texas has been hit. I don't think it's unwound yet at all, and it eventually will be, but it specifically has hit energy right now, and very few people think, well, it's not the Fed's fault on this. There are other factors too, no doubt, but I think the Fed, it couldn't have happened, the boom couldn't have been so great if you wouldn't have had the Fed artificially pushing prices of oil up and artificially giving credit to the people who wanted to speculate and go and find alternative sources of energy. So booms on the short run look great, but when the bust comes, it's not so good.
Yes, that's for sure, and we'll talk about that next. We just discussed how the Fed creates the boom, but all artificial economic conditions must come into an end. All illusions must eventually be shattered, and that's when the crisis occurs. During the dot-com boom, all those companies that weren't making profits or even revenues, for that matter, they folded immediately. During the housing crisis, quote unquote, that's when we're left with all those foreclosures and empty shopping centers littered throughout the country now that are just sitting there. And it also takes a personal effect on people with broken lives, divorces, and even some people commit suicide. It gets so bad. So, Dr. Paul, let's discuss the bust cycle. And even down in Texas, you now get to see the other side of the coin with the oil rigs closing. So let's go over that next.
Yeah, well, it does hurt a lot of innocent people, the laborers who looked like they were going to have a good job, and the business people who honestly invested because they thought the economic conditions and economic signals were correct. They all suffer. There's going to be a lot of people who lose their money and lose their investment. A lot of people are going to lose their jobs. And then there's one thing that people don't look at is, you look at maybe the people who are drilling for oil or doing the fracking, but there are many the service industries that grow up around the oil and the development, the people who make the pipe and all the other services that have to be used to produce the oil. But when you have the boom, there's an economic law that it comes in and said there's a limit to the boom. There's a limit because the boom stage increases malinvestment, too much investment going to the wrong place, too much debt, and it then requires a correction. Early on, even when we had the Fed, this occurred rather quickly. There was a lot of malinvestment in spending during the World War I, and so there was inflation of the money supply, inflation of prices, and it required a correction. Back then, they didn't have a Federal Reserve that was so involved in manipulating the economy at all stages, so they just kept hands off, and there was a depression. Depression in 1921, the corrections were made. But something happened, especially since 1971, and in particular in this century, in the last 15, 16 years, is that nobody wanted to have the corrections because eventually it became politically unpopular because it would increase unemployment and there would be pain for it, and it wasn't, people didn't like this. So what we did, we ended up with a Fed, and unfortunately somebody that knows about the free market and even the gold standard, Greenspan, he was determined that he could keep this thing from going down. So he was well known even by some of the Keynesian economists. They wanted to blame somebody. They said, well, it's all Greenspan's fault. He kept interest rates too low too long, hoping that there would never have to be a correction. But then the people who took over from Greenspan, even up until this day, they all will do anything, to keep it from the correction. But there'd be, if the interest rates have went up 1%, the cost to governments and everybody else is trillions of dollars. So it's unsustainable. That's why they will continue to do this until the market forces are so great that the bust will occur anyway. But if we should stay out of the problems, but if there is the inflation and there is a bust, the only way you can get real economic growth again is the liquidation of debt. Individuals who get in over their head, they speculate, they start a new business, it's not going well, and they can't make their payments, they're not going to do well until they get rid of that debt. If they're required to pay that debt. So they either have to work their way out of it, they have to go into bankruptcy, there has to be a liquidation, then there can be economic growth. But if you're sitting there with all your earnings going in, not even paying the interest, but if there's no interest on loans, people don't worry about that so much. But what if they just have to pay some principal and they can't do it? And then that closes things down. There has to be a correction. And this is where we have gone wrong in these last several decades. We do not allow the correction to occur, and that is so necessary. So we know where the boom comes from, and unfortunately, the bust is the market trying to say you have to make these corrections, but we have these sophisticated, well-educated, fancy university people who come along and say, aha, we can take care of this. One time I was talking to one of the Federal Reserve Board chairmen, and the subject of savings came up because savings are really important to help determine the real interest rates. I said, there's no savings. At that particular time, it was down to 1% and 2%. People were saving nothing. And but he argued with me, and this was before the housing bubble burst. And he says, no, they have savings. Just look, they bought this house for $100,000. It's worth $150,000. So they have $50,000 saving. I said, I don't think that's exactly the same thing. And of course, a few years later, all that vanished because it was fiction. And yet they're not willing to admit to that. And there's a powerful special interest groups that demand this, and they become dependent on it. Whether it's the government people and the politicians, the big banks, the military-industrial complex, the welfare state. So this is why I'm not expecting the Fed all of a sudden to try to correct these policies, because the price would be so high. But there's only one thing worse than facing up to the reality of that, and that is continue to do what we have now and let the market take care of that. And that is a serious problem. Like today, we had a GDP figure come out. It's devastating. There's essentially no growth. And the dollar went down over 1% in one day. what if that becomes a habit? That's huge. And of course, Golden responded to this. But no, it's a bad system. We have to admit that there's no magic. You can't create wealth out of thin air by creating money. Monetary units have nothing to do with wealth. Only hard work, savings, and production is what produces wealth, and not the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is in the business of destroying wealth and transferring wealth at the meantime where some people benefit and other people suffer.
Yes, let's finish up on a positive note on how to get out of this roller coaster that the Fed has subjected us to. And all the pain that comes with their economic booms and busts, it's totally unnecessary. We really don't have to live this way. However, as long as the Fed exists, we do have to live this way. We have to go through the cycles. So let's talk about real free market economics, sound money, what life would look like and should look like with market interest rates, and how that would lead to general and genuine prosperity.
Yes, and we mentioned how we get into the trouble with the boom and the excessive money creation, low interest rates, and we talked about the bust, what has to come, and we should allow that to happen. And we certainly are realizing this. And under these conditions, you could do it theoretically, let the bankruptcies roll. Politically, I don't believe that's going to happen. But it would be much better to prevent this. Just as in foreign policy, I think of all the things that we do, we dig a hole for ourselves being involved in so many places around the world. Then we don't know what the final policy is supposed to be. When do we leave? When do we come home? And that's the way it is in economics. We get so involved, we don't know how to come back. But we should realize that prevention would be very, very helpful. And that, of course, would be a free market. You would governments, when they were in the money business, and they always seem to be in the money business, but when capitalism and free markets thrived the most was when the government was limited to maintaining the value of the currency, the stability of the currency, and not pretending that they can produce economic growth and make stable prices and do all these things. That they weren't able to do that. So with this, the fiat money, they believe it's, of course, a panacea. But in the free market, they're not allowed to use fiat money. The money supply increases, in a market fashion, and there's a measurement of value, and that has to do with the currencies being attached to precious metals. And a lot of people, say, well, we can't do that because there's not enough gold in the world. Well, that's been refuted. Hans Sennholz has a great article, if you look it up, why we do have enough gold for any circumstances. You don't have to have, so much per person. But if you want to maintain the value of the currency in all these transactions, it's sort of like maintaining a measuring rod. But, if you're building a building and your measuring rod is a yardstick and it changes every day, you end up with a messy building. And that's about what we do with our money. It's changing value all the time. We're making mistakes. We overinvest and we measure incorrectly. So that is what you would have if you had a currency related to the metals. And it would emphasize savings. But today, if you save, you're not a good person because you're supposed to spend the money. Keynesians hate savers. You got to go out there and spend your money. But in the old days, when people were more self-reliant and didn't depend on printing money and the government passing it out, they would save their money. They would be frugal, and they did better in their retirement than they do today, even with Social Security. So this is something that would be beneficial if we restored the principle of savings, and it would be necessary in this situation. The other thing that people have to recognize under the free market system is the system that we don't like. It's really a form of theft, and it's a moral issue. When governments just create units out of thin air and say it has value and they run the world, if an individual did this, if he counterfeited the money, he'd go to prison. The founders actually thought that if you counterfeited the money, you deserved the death penalty. That's how much they hated the inflation. But taxes would go down under the circumstances of the free market, because the printing of money is a tax. You value of the money, and the government gets the benefit from this. And borrowing is encouraged under the fiat system. It would be discouraged because you wouldn't be able to borrow at 0%, and the governments would be encouraged to do this. So there's so much benefits from this. But the free market and sound money comes together with what liberty is all about. Once people understand what true liberty is all about, and the government is there to protect the freedoms of individuals and protect the soundness of money, and not to run our lives and run and regulate the economy and police the world, there would be no motive for saying that we can finance this, through the fiat system. That, of course, is what we continue to work for, and we certainly hope that someday we will see that. And I think that is the road to peace and prosperity, which is a very positive goal. Chris, I want to thank you very much today for being with us, and we'll be probably talking about this next week, possibly.
Yes, it's not going away soon, but we'll stay on top of it, Dr. Paul.
Okay, Chris, and thank you for being with us, and I want to thank all the viewers today for being with us at the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.